All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of our research webinar series here hosted by the team at Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we introduce today's presenters, we want to take a moment to read a disclaimer. Our webinar today will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during the webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or MVLRI and are not given nor endorsed by MVU or MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Before we begin today, we dive into our presentation on the research that is out there and then the research that's required in blended and online physical education. I want to take a moment to introduce our presenters. First, we have with us David N. Daum, PhD. Dr. Daum has been involved in scholarship related to online physical education since 2007 when he was a master's student at California State University at Chico. It was his fascination with blended and online physical education's rapid growth with no apparent guidance that led him to pursuing and earning his doctorate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research areas include K-12 blended and online physical education curricula, how that curricula is implemented, and the impact of that curricula. In addition, he is interested in how technology is defined and utilized in online, blended, and face-to-face classrooms. For future research projects, he would like to examine K-12 blended and online physical education courses' impact on student learning and physical activity levels. We also have with us Craig Buschner, EDD. Professor Craig Buschner has over 40 years of experience in the field of education. Prior to his work in higher education, Craig was an elementary physical education specialist in Macomb, Illinois. He received his degrees from Virginia Commonwealth University, Western Illinois University, and Oklahoma State University. His professional service includes numerous presentations at state, district, national, and international conferences and the publication of book chapters and articles to include the Journal of Technology Physical Education, Quest, Journal of Classroom Interaction, Contemporary Education, and the Journal of Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance. He authored the book Teaching Children Movement Concepts and Skills, Becoming a Master Teacher, published in 1994. Finally, Craig served as the president and national spokesperson for the National Association for Sport and Physical Education from 2007 and 2008. This professional organization is now called the Society of Health and Physical Educators, or SHAPE. With that, I want to welcome our presenters, and I will hand it over to them.
Okay, I hope that everybody can hear me. This is Craig Buschner from California State University, Chico. And I would like to welcome all of you to our webinar. And I'd like to give thanks to certainly the MVLRI and Catherine Kennedy for connecting us with your wonderful work there in Michigan. And thank you so much, Justin, for getting us started today and providing a fantastic resource for teachers, professors, researchers, administrators in education to advance online and blended learning. So I'll go first just to let you know how we'll proceed here today. Then David will jump in after we move forward, and then we'll kind of go back and forth with the final couple of slides. To give you a little idea of our session today, I'd like to just share with you that we'll start out by sort of looking at student learning in K-12 physical education. I'm not sure of the audience and their background, but to make sure that you're sort of clear with what we regard as the purpose of physical education. Then I'll take you through a brief history of online and blended physical education. David will share with you the evidence base, the limited evidence base that we have regarding online and blended learning. And then we'll proceed with some implications for policy and practice based upon these limited data and limited studies, some implications for future research. And then we're going to bring you back to the purpose and revisit the purpose of K-12 physical education. And we've designed this session so that we could interact hopefully with you through the chat room and maybe address some of the questions that you might have about our presentation today. So it looks like Justin has just sort of cued everybody for that. So let's just sort of start out here with something that's very clear to people in the field that are in the know about why we have physical education at the K-12 level. And SHAPE has our national association that's been in existence through many different name changes for over 100 years to develop physically literate individuals who have the knowledge, skills, and confidence to enjoy a lifetime of healthful physical activity. So to guide children and youth in the process of being physically active for life. That's our primary goal, our primary purpose for children and adolescents in K-12 physical education. And SHAPE has gone on to further define a physically literate person to include these five aspects. Literate person or student in K-12 physical education would have learned the skills necessary to participate in a wide range of physical activities. And skills here, we're talking primarily motor skills, the kinds of things that might be involved in games, sports, dance, exercise, outdoor education, aquatics, so the movement skills. That the physically literate person in physical education understands or knows the implications and benefits of being physically active in today's life. Third, that a physically literate person would value activity enough to participate regularly in physical activity. There's such good evidence out there that's been accumulated for the last 10 to 20 years about the value of physical activity in everybody's life. So we want them to take time either during in school or out of school to be active at least 60 minutes a day, according to recent research by the CDC, the National Institute of Health, American Heart Association, and SHAPE. And then we would like for children and youth to be physically fit, to move towards becoming more fit and healthy. Fitness is one of those kinds of things that you can have it and then lose it, or some children never even sort of gain a level of fitness. But it's sort of that goal to move towards becoming more physically fit, which involves cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength and endurance, flexibility, and an appropriate body composition for one's size and age. And then, finally, that we would want children and youth to value physical activity and its contributions to a healthy lifestyle. So if you really sort of look at those 5 areas regarding the physically literate person, we have national standards that have been pretty well accepted by people in the profession that focus upon motor skills, knowledge, regular participation, fitness valuing, and even the other standard that's not implied there is personal and social responsibility for self and others in physical activity. So we're clear in our field about what we need to do to help children and youth, The question is sort of making sure that curriculum, be it face-to-face, blended, or virtual, in fact meets these standards. So then our unique challenge in our subject matter area is, first of all, that certainly cognitive learning takes place. We value critical thinking. Reading should be part of quality physical education. Language arts, writing, speaking, and even the use of computational skills in physical education should take place. However, we also have that third domain of psychomotor learning, which I described earlier, to include, throwing, striking, running, dancing, sports, games, exercise, and really that that movement response that's elicited through good teaching, through learning, through participation. So the learning response is not just sort of a cognitive response or speaking or writing or computing some numbers, but actually moving, actually performing. And so that's one of the challenges with not just face-to-face, but with online and blended learning. And then again, one of the strengths I think that most teachers in the field and most leaders in the field have always valued was the affective development and the development of personal and social responsibility that oftentimes results from cooperation, teamwork, setting goals, taking responsibility to lead, to follow, and somehow protecting that part of the literacy of a child or adolescent in physical education. Let me just share with you a brief history of online and of online physical education and blended physical education. Certainly, much like other areas of the curriculum, there was a lot of school district experimentation, in the past 15 years. Even before that, in our field, there was a movement called competency-based interventions or instruction that was part of the last century. And certainly distance learning has been around, and there's been experimentation with distance learning in many subject areas in school for students, not just for credit recovery, but to meet the needs of students in a variety of situations to enhance their learning. As Justin actually mentioned earlier, our national association, NASPE, changed and is now called SHAPE. But when I was part of the board of directors and ultimately the president of our national organization, which has about 25,000 members, there was a real call to action back in 2005 and 2006, particularly from the Midwestern part of the country, where teachers were asking about guidelines, about policies, about the national organization's position on online physical education. And of course, much like technology in everyday life, the technology was there, but we didn't really have a position. We really didn't. It was sort of the cart before the horse. The technology was there, and online learning was taking place, but we didn't really have a position to how that might take place. So subsequently, I wrote an article in one of our professional journals, and we developed a guidelines task force. David Daum was part of that as a graduate student, working on his master's degree in 2007, and we had people from around the country as a part of those initial guidelines for online physical education. And we did our best to sort of guide teachers and professors and other folks that were implementing and putting together physical education with blended and online learning. And interestingly enough, those guidelines, now, 8 years old, we need those revised, and we're in the process of trying to update those to really help teachers in the schools. along the way, I want you also to know that that our field has always been an advocate of appropriate use of instructional technology, and and so we have guidelines for all kinds of tools, pedometers, instructional videos, heart rate monitors, all kinds of things that we certainly value the use of a variety of tools in learning and physical education for K-12 teachers. But we also sort of have a position that they are in fact just tools to enhance learning for students. They do not become the end all in learning, but tools to help teachers, to help students learn. And so this paper that was put out in 2009 was talking about appropriate use of instructional technology, which also online and blended learning is implied. Subsequently, we had three Shape of the Nation reports, these Sun reports that were put together in 2006, 2010, and 2012. And really, these reports have looked at the status of physical education across the 50 states, looked at the policies and practices of school districts with regarding to school physical education, and sort of requirements by schools at the elementary, middle, secondary level, assessment, online learning, professional development of teachers. So we're trying to be very thorough with regard to advancing these standards for learning and the purpose of learning, and trying to not update not only teachers but administrators and parents about the direction of school physical education in the United States. And this little graph here is pretty simple, but with regard to these three different Shape of the Nation reports regarding school physical education, you can see an increase in the number of online states that are advocating and or sanctioning online learning at this point in time. So we've grown from 12 states in 2006 to 30 states. Our most recent report was 3 years ago in 2012. Interestingly enough, only 17 of these 30 states require that these online physical education courses to be taught by certified physical education teachers in those states. And oftentimes the decisions about online physical education are made at the district level. And states such as Alaska, Indiana, Minnesota, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Ohio, Oregon, Vermont, and Virginia are part of some of those states that are making district level decisions with regard to online physical education, which is exciting, but we really don't have good data and from these states or from these school districts about learning. So the other unfortunate part about the Shape of the Nation reports is that they really fail to mention other kinds of facts regarding curricular focus, pedagogical strategies used in these online courses, or even evidence of student learning, which obviously is a key to schools and children and the purpose of learning. So I'm just going to take you back. I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but this was a little chart that I put together in the paper that I wrote for Joford back in 2006. And I was trying to use a balanced approach when there was sort of this call to action about online physical education. And the idea was to sort of help teachers and people in our field, professionals, really sort of look at some of the advantages and maybe potentially some of the disadvantages of online physical education. I think the ultimate, which is, what I have sort of highlighted or bolded there, number 5 under disadvantages, is that it's really difficult to determine worth of something when we have very little data to really help us to understand whether or not it works and whether or not students are learning, and certainly under what conditions that we'll come back to. So I think a lot of us in the field have been trying to keep a very open mind about the use of online physical education and the benefits, but oftentimes it's promoted, it's implemented, but we don't have a lot of information to share, or very little published information, which David will get to in a second. In the initial guidelines document that was put together in 2007, knowing the movement towards online and blended learning in the United States, looking at lots of different groups, the NEA and other groups that were sort of trying to make sense of where we're going with online instruction in the United States, we stated in this document that we had no published evidence of learning in physical education by teachers or school districts in online PE, that taking that into consideration, that we advocated, if experimentation was going to take place, that a blended model of online physical education might be best as we know more and as we maybe gather data. And we said, quote, that it's a reasonable instructional alternative for this subject matter until further research is available. And it's an exciting, it's an attractive yet untested alternative to delivering quality physical education. I guess I should add too here that certainly I want the audience to know that we haven't been always pleased with face-to-face instruction in physical education across the board. There are wonderful teachers and wonderful programs with face-to-face physical education. There's average programs, and then there's programs that really need a lot of work. And I think that we need to consider that as part of the backdrop when we think about online and blended learning for the field of physical education. And then finally, before we move to some of the limited research that David will tell you about, it's pretty much online physical education, this subject matter of school physical education, K-12, is pretty much a U.S. Phenomena. And we have sort of pockets of experimentation going on. Don Kane in Columbus, Ohio, has been leading online physical education in the public schools at the high school level there for at least a decade now, and has presented with us at national conferences and is doing some quality work. I'd also like to sort of recognize the Florida virtual schools, and of course Russell Dreesen is, I think, part of our participants today, and they have done some fantastic work in Florida with physical education, with their course shell over many years now, helping students to develop a lot of these purposes and standards in physical education in the state of Florida. Interestingly enough, the course shell that has been developed for the Florida virtual schools is now being used in the Cayman Islands, in Mexico, in New Zealand, in Puerto Rico, in Venezuela, and a few other countries. But what's interesting is having participated in some international conferences, as we talk to people in Europe and China and Asia and South America, oftentimes they're not creating their own online physical education coursework for school-age children. They sort of oftentimes wonder why that we're doing this in the United States. And so they're very interested in knowing more, and maybe this is one of the reasons why the course shell and that the Florida Virtual Schools has developed is so exciting for some of these countries that really need some expertise in knowing how to engage teachers and learners in online physical education. But again, it seems to be somewhat of a USA phenomena. And then I'd like to just say that as I have been studying this for nearly a decade now, there seems to be an awful lot of wildcatting sort of going on. And so, interestingly enough, in my own area of Northern California in Chico, I had a high school athletic director and physical education coordinator recently send me a proposal, and actually implemented a program with some online physical education at the high school level. and she said, do you know anything about this topic? And she's maybe 5 miles down the road, and so it's and really what's interesting is that a lot of teachers out there are looking to figure this out and to understand how to enhance student learning. But there's very few sources out there to help them. So with that little introduction, and David, I hope I haven't gone on too long here. I'm going to turn it over to you and let you talk about some of the empirical research in the field.
All right, thanks, Craig. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. All right, so like Craig, he just provided us with a brief overview of kind of the history, or at least our involvement in online physical education. I've noticed that some of the people that have shown up, I believe if the Brian is the Brian I think it is, and it's Brian Mosier, and looks like Leslie Williams and Russell, who are all folks that we've, that Katie might be Katie Carone. But all folks that are intimately familiar with online physical education. Some of those names we'll actually see up here with the research. When we wrote the chapter, the research we see on the screen now is really the research that had been done at that time, that had been published or completed. I know Leslie actually has completed, her and Katie Carone had completed another study that they presented a little bit of data on at our national conference a couple months ago. And I really look forward to seeing that data published. But really, like Craig mentioned, we have a very limited research base when it comes to not only blended but online physical education. And actually, we know more about online physical education than we know about blended physical education. And in my mind, that's almost a little uh, surprising, because we almost would think that blended would be a more desirable uh, product, that we would want that to happen over fully online, especially when we're talking about physical education, because we have that physical part that Craig was talking about. I mean, that's when you go into any physical education program, that is what we see. We see the physical, we see people moving. And that really is the focus of what we do, the primary focus. And of course, those other things, the cognitive learning and the affective learning, are also important. But really, there was only one peer-reviewed article addressing secondary blended physical education. There was one that that kind of compared an online a face-to-face blended and online weight training course. There have been 3 studies that address secondary online physical education, and then there were 3 doctoral dissertations that addressed online physical education. As far as what we know about blended physical education, the study that was done in 2003. Part of me says, well, the technology in 2003, does it invalidate the findings of the study? And I say, in my mind, no. Because blended technology, we can still, it has taken many forms, just like online education, used to be distance education and giving people videotapes and all that. So it's all evolved, but when we look at the findings of the study, we can actually see comparative results across even recent studies, as far as, having control over the pace of learning, and certain students liking it better because of it meets their learning style better. Even now, with technology being better, well, supposedly better than it was, um, students still now, today in 2015, still struggle with the technology. Online students, regardless of whether it's face-to-face or blended or online, still struggle with um, the lack of face-to-face contact with their peers and their teachers. Which is important. And again, because, like what Craig was mentioning, a very important aspect of what we do is the affective domain and social interaction, and teamwork and cooperation. It's not that those things are impossible in the online domain. We just have to think differently about how we accomplish those skills. One of the benefits, obviously, that from this study, that what they found was that the blended students gained knowledge, and that's important. You know, knowledge is very important. They didn't do skills testing, so we don't know about their skills. We don't know if they increased motor skills or fitness or anything like that. This study really only focused on the cognitive learning aspect of blended learning. And unfortunately, this is the only study that we know of that it really compares face-to-face and blended physical education. If I were a betting man, I would say that this is actually probably the most common form across the country. Um, just because I think a lot of us use blended learning, but we may not necessarily realize it's blended learning because that's now the common way of teaching. You know, just putting everything, you know, a lot of the cognitive information online, using online discussions to supplement things that we do in the classroom. And we may not even view it as blended learning anymore just because it is so commonplace. But this is an area that we definitely need more research because, like I said, as far as I know, this is the only study that has addressed blended physical education. As far as, you know, physical activity, uh, this is obviously an important factor for us. Um, what we know about physical activity levels in online physical education courses is that, so there are some physical education courses that either don't meet the standards, the recommendations by NASPE or SHAPE, but there's also some online physical education courses that don't require any physical activity, which, you know, in our field is obviously very extremely concerning. We want physical activity to happen. That's obviously something, again, that we value. The most common form of assessment, and those of you that are familiar with, you know, valid forms of assessment, were activity logs, self-report activity logs. And something that we presented on in our national conference a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago was different ways around that using, you know, all the technology that we have available now, the activity tracking devices, you know, could provide better data when it comes to actually ensuring that physical activity actually happened. One of the things that the studies that have been completed have shown is that gains in fitness have generated mixed results. And with that the study about the college students, the blended and online sections of that class did not improve their bench press or their squat scores, but they did include or increase cardiovascular fitness. Where the Futrell study with high school students, they increased their flexibility and muscular strength, but they did not include or increase cardiovascular fitness. So the two studies that have been done, while one was with college students, one with high school students, they do conflict with one another as far as the actual gains in fitness, at least the fitness components with physical education or online physical education. What we don't know, and this is very concerning for us, especially when we're talking about, you know, younger grades, elementary and middle school specifically, is that there's no studies right now that have been conducted with blended or online physical education in regards to motor skill development, because we view motor skill development, especially at the younger grades, as paramount. That is the most important thing. Because those gains in basic motor skills is what sets students up for the rest of their lives as far as movement and being competent movers. And without that, you know, we know with confidence and competence, they're really related. So if we can get students competent and confident earlier in their life, that means they might be more able and likely to participate in physical activities later in life. So that is something that we need to study is how can we teach motor skills, not just fitness, because fitness is important, but we're also talking about motor skills, you know, things like throwing, catching, even running, you know, is a motor skill. And we got to figure out how to teach those most efficiently. What we know about the students, and again, kind of going back to the literature on other subjects, is that there's a lot of similarities between what our studies in online physical education have compared to the same results in other subject matters, is flexibility is a big thing that comes up. Not only flexibility for the learners, but flexibility for the teachers, which we'll talk about here in a second. But one of the things that came up in the Carpenter Woods and the Williams study is that the students enjoyed a greater flexibility in choosing where and when they are physically active. And that's very important when we're thinking about physical education. So one of the most awkward things, and some of you will remember this in high school and middle school physical education, is not only performing physical activities in front of your peers, but getting dressed out in the locker room. And that was always, a trying time for any teenager. And especially if you're thinking about your overweight students and maybe your students who don't get along with their peers socially, this online mode might be more attractive just because they get to do what they want, when they want, and they don't have to dress out in front of their peers. One of the things that I really liked in the Williams study was that students found the learning to be more relevant. Because of that flexibility, because of choosing where and when they were physically active, they felt the learning that was happening was more relevant. And I think that's a very important point, because if it's more relevant, then hopefully the idea is that they are more likely to continue this after the class is completed. And that's, I think, the goal of any class, to get students to engage in the content well after they've left your classroom. As far as the teachers, the folks who actually teach the classes, our profession in general is very split on the value and perception of online physical education. The detractors that, even the people that teach it, this is not just the people that have never taught it before, the people that teach these classes, they question the accuracy and the accountability of student learning. Which again is something that we need to get better at. I mean, that's online learning in general, not just online physical education. But one of the things that Craig mentioned about the Shape of the Nation reports is that only 17 of the 30 states required their teachers to have teaching license. Well, the studies that had been completed on teachers, all of the teachers had teaching license, which is a good thing, even though apparently those states had laws or mandates that said that they didn't need to have them. They do. But a little bit of an asterisk next to that. Some of those studies, that was part of their admission criteria for the study, was that those teachers had to have a teaching license. So it's not that it's not happening, but hopefully all the teachers that are actually teaching online physical education are not just managers of a learning environment, but are actually teachers and are licensed teachers. Again, flexibility comes up. One of the things that I think once you start teaching online, that you get to know your students in a different way, and I think that's one of the things that these teachers experienced. These were all, for the most part, they had taught face-to-face, and some of them for a good amount of their career, and then they started teaching online later in their career, and they really enjoyed getting to know their students on a one-on-one basis. And some of the teachers I talked to really talked about how they really got to know their students better in the online environment as opposed to the face-to-face. Because when we're teaching face-to-face, some of those classes are 50, 60 students large, and it's really hard to get to know your students on a one-to-one basis. One of the things also about teacher characteristics and students' characteristics is the different schedule. And being accessible at past the normal business hours was also something that came up. Teacher educators, so physical education teacher educators, some of us in the room that teach future teachers, they really lack the knowledge of what is happening in K-12 online physical education. And one of the questions I kind of had was, is that really different than what we know about face-to-face? In some ways, the answer is it is different. That we know for the most part what is happening in our area, but we may not know what's happening nationwide. And the same thing I think is happening in online and blended learning, with teacher educators. They kind of know what's going on in their area, but they may not know what's going on around the country. These teacher educators that were interviewed, they felt that teaching fitness was possible, but motor skills would be challenging, just like we were talking about earlier. They felt the strength of online physical education would be the cognitive learning, which, and that's for any subject, the cognitive learning, that is really the strength of the online platform. They believed, at least some of them believed, that the creativity of the online teacher will trump the pitfalls of online physical education. So some of those difficulties in assessment, or the inability, at least the perception of the inability to meet certain standards, would be, countered by the creativity of a teacher. And I think what Craig was mentioning earlier is, we're not always happy with the face-to-face teaching. We've got bad teachers out there. We've got mediocre teachers. We've got good teachers. Well, the same thing is going to happen in the online environment. One of the arguments I kind of use, or at least not necessarily an argument, but a counterpoint to people who say, oh, online learning is the worst thing in the world, is, would you rather have your student, your child, in a bad face-to-face class or a really good online class? And that gets them to stop, think about it. And usually, like, well, yeah, I'd rather have them in, with a good teacher in the good online environment. So it's always interesting just to kind of think about things in different ways. And I think the creativity of a teacher, no matter what environment, will always find ways around, the disadvantages or the pitfalls related to any environment. The teacher educators really were not on board with online physical education with elementary students. They felt it was just too critical of a time period in their lives for motor skill development that online physical education was just really not feasible at that level. They were split at middle school level just because of, well, middle school students are weird. I mean, it's a strange time in their life. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of learning that they still need to have and happen. And the profession really wasn't, they just really weren't sure about whether it was appropriate for them. They kind of went back and forth, and for some it would work and some it wouldn't. But they mostly supported online physical education for high school students. And the sentiment there was that they had the foundational skills. They had developed all of the basic locomotor and manipulative skills, and they could really start to figure things out on their own. And they've got those independent learning skills, which are extremely important in the online environment. And then they really believed that the blended model would be best. However, one of the things that we really have to think about is, is that a viable model, the blended model? Because really the benefit of online physical education is, or just online education in general, is that you can do it from wherever and not be having to actually go somewhere. Obviously, the implication for the research, the big thing is that we need more. We need to know more about the students. We need to know more about the teachers. And I think we really need to investigate the blended model and really figure out, what is a viable way of doing it, and figuring out what works. Teaching models is something I think we really need to explore. We've got a lot of literature in physical education on sport education and personal system of instruction, and TPSR, Teaching Personal Social Responsibility Model, Teaching Games for Understanding. We have a lot of literature about face-to-face models, but we really don't have anything online. We really need to investigate what would work. We need valid and reliable tools for assessing the shape standards, and then we need to investigate how to maximize the use of technology without encouraging sedentary behavior. And then Craig now is going to take over and talk about policies.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I appreciate all 10 of you staying with us. I hope you feel like that we're helping to engage you in this particular topic. We'll come back to some of the questions and research implications, but it might be wise also to think in terms of, at least at this point, some policy implications and practice implications. And a couple of the ideas that we have written to in our chapter are a few for you to consider. And one of the things that I think it's important is that we sort of develop minimal learner expectations for the future of blended and online physical education courses, primarily at the secondary level. And so, in other words, for students to be successful in a blended and online environment, what kinds of expectations do we need regarding technological readiness, with regard to motor skill background, with regard to other aspects, the reading level. So, obviously, like any subject area, we want our children and youth to be successful in the online environment. So, at a minimum, what do we need to set, for these courses in the future? Which leads to the second sort of point there regarding the verification of student readiness. And we've even considered sort of like the idea of making sure that a student has at least passed a face-to-face physical education course first and has a broad foundation and understanding and value for physical activity, has a modicum of motor skills, so that, again, the course that they're enrolled in the blended or online environment will meet their needs, and they'll feel confident and competent and successful in that course. And regarding the subject matter area, we really need to do a better job at defining the type of learning, the amount of learning that is acceptable at various grade levels. So even though we have pretty good K-12 curricula set out for us with the models that David just talked about, the curriculum models, we have to sort of rethink that a little bit and how that would fit and work, how much learning can take place, the type of learning, the outcomes. So the conversion, I guess, really from the face-to-face models that we're so familiar with over many years to the online environment. And we've hit this pretty hard, but really making sure that we do have content experts that are leading the online physical education courses. So either through training and or certification, state certification, through their undergraduate, graduate programs, making sure that we have people that are leading and designing these programs that have content expertise in the field. And so we're concerned about that if we want to really get back to a student becoming physically literate. And then sort of, again, verification of physical activity and learning must take place. In other words, when students are, when we assess students in the online and blended environments, that we can, justify the course based upon the learning that's taken place, and that we have valid and reliable assessments, that there's honesty with regard to who actually completes the work. And so, much like any other subject area, just making sure that the physical activity piece and that learning that takes place can be verified. And then, I'm one of these people. Teacher educators need to sort of open their eyes up and get into the literature and help the next generation of physical education teachers that will be moving out to the public and private schools in the country, so that they're prepared, so that they're ready for all the options that we would want students to have regarding blended and online learning. So we have a lot of work to do in our field, and we can't sort of just tuck our heads and look the other way. We have work to do, and I think this is why some of the people that are participants today, and David and I and others in the field, Russell Dreesen and Leslie and Brian Mosier, all are really trying to move forward with an innovative and valuable way for learning to take place in physical education. Lots of unanswered questions, and we can talk a little bit more about these as we sort of finish up here. But big questions. What is best practice? I mean, we're pretty far away from that right now. We know that there are pockets of programs that are good out there in the blended and online areas at the secondary level, but I don't think we're quite there yet with regard to being able to identify best practices. Again, getting back to the content that's best suited for online physical education, attacking those pedagogical challenges that David mentioned, not just for teachers and parents and administrators, but for the students in that online environment. Again, ensuring that they learn, helping that standard for the teacher to be able to plan for the socialization piece, and then again, getting back to the modification to verify the motor skill acquisition and the verification of the fitness levels of the students. Again, I'd like to thank Catherine for highlighting our chapter in the book, the Handbook of Research on K-12 Online and Blended Learning, that was published just in December of 2014. And is edited by Richard Ferdig and Catherine. There's a really important chapter in there that we think ours is important, but John Watson from the Evergreen Education Group and Amy Murin's first chapter on the history of K-12 online and blended instruction stated in their chapter, just because online learning can work does not mean online learning will work. As with traditional brick and mortar education, there are many high quality schools and many that fall short. Many online teachers are well trained while others are not. Many online courses are steeped in current pedagogy while others are not. Determining which courses, schools, and instructional models are creating positive outcomes remains a challenge for all educators, policymakers, but particularly for online providers. And then later at the end of the chapter, the editor of the handbook, Richard Ferdig, stated that maybe the question isn't, does online work, does online education work, or does online physical education work? The question might be better asked, under what conditions does online learning work in education as well as in physical education? So, I think with regard to developing a research space, we have a lot to do. Turn it back over to David to wrap it up.
So we're going to kind of come back and revisit the purpose of physical education, and just kind of piggyback what Craig just said about validating, online education. For Craig and I and others, for us, it's not necessarily about validating blended and online physical education, but it's ensuring that blended online physical education meets the needs of the stakeholders. It meets the needs of the people that are vested, the students, the teachers, the parents, communities, and that it meets educational learning standards, and really for physical education, that it promotes lifelong physical activity. So again, kind of coming back to the purpose, can we accomplish the purpose of physical education with online and blended learning? Well, online physical education definitely has its strengths and weaknesses. Blended seems to address some of those apparent weaknesses as far as assessment is concerned, because you can do the assessment face-to-face. But blended does seem less viable just because of the whole face-to-face part. So can we accomplish these things? Yeah, I think we can. One of the things that can online physical education accomplish everything that the traditional physical education curriculum can do? Yeah, I think the answer to that is no, mainly because of the motor skill learning component. But that doesn't mean that it cannot be viable and it cannot be beneficial to meet the goals and the purpose of physical education, because we can still accomplish fitness, we can still accomplish the cognitive learning and even the social learning online. But there are going to be weaknesses. But you know what? There's weaknesses in the face-to-face arena as well. Not every face-to-face course meets every single standard. And again, when we go back to the example of good teachers, mediocre teachers, and bad teachers, it really is dependent on the teacher that you have in the classroom as far as what your student is going to learn in the class. One of the things that I'm just going to pull the line from the chapter that we wrote that I really liked was that administrators, parents, and teachers who value educating the whole child and student learning cannot afford that blended and online physical education become a physical activity wasteland. Current and future blended and online physical education courses must ensure student learning and influence the next generation of movers to become physically active and healthy for a lifetime. And I really think that's why a lot of us are here. I mean, that's what we want, is we want it to be better for our students, and we want to know the best way of doing it. And like we've said multiple times already today, we need more research to not necessarily validate, but to determine what are best practices. Physical education face-to-face went through that research explosion, 40 years ago, of just trying to figure out, what is happening in the physical education environment, what is the best way of doing it, and the field has done nothing but grow since then as far as the literature base. Well, we need the same thing in physical education, our online physical education. We need to figure out what works, what doesn't, what are the best methods of doing things, and go from there. So we'd really like to thank the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and all of you for attending. Catherine did post the book if you didn't see the chapter or the link to that. I also earlier posted Craig and my email addresses, so if you ever have any questions, anything like that, you can feel free to contact us in that way. So now we'd like to open it up for questions, comments, anything that you all want to discuss.
Hi, Craig and David. This is Catherine. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And I'm going to jump back a little bit to the unanswered question. It has a little bit to do with that. But oftentimes, as you know, this practice, the online and blended learning in K-12 is kind of the cart before the horse phenomenon. It happens before best practices are really suggested and any research has been done on it. And so if I were a newly minted certified physical education instructor who was asked by my district to teach an online course to my students, how would you suggest to design the course?
It's a great question. There's no simple answer, as you know, to that question. The big thing is making sure that, obviously the technology accessible to your students, making sure that they can accomplish everything that you want them to accomplish, and really clearly defining what it is that you want students to learn. Like we mentioned earlier in the presentation, I think fitness education makes sense. Motor skill learning really doesn't with the technology that is readily available. So if you're going to do things, make sure that you're going to set up your class to properly assess your students, hold them accountable for not only the cognitive learning, but the social learning, and then of course the psychomotor learning, where you're actually using some type of physical activity tracker. Don't just do a fitness log, because students can make that up. Even if you have parents, sign off on it, having some other form of verification of physical activity would be extremely important. Other than that, making sure, of course, they use basic online learning pedagogy, such as making the course easily accessible and using the technology that students have access to. But I think, for Craig and I think I can speak for him as well, but really talking about the assessment piece, make sure that that's well designed, and making sure that you really thought about how you're going to do that and do that well.
Yeah, let me respond real quick too. Hopefully you can hear me as well. And I think, Catherine, number one would be to look at successful models in other subject matter areas. And
does anybody other questions?
Okay, everyone, if you do have any other questions, please go ahead and submit them through the chat window, or feel free to reach out to our presenters who did a great job presenting today. So thank you so much, David and Craig, for sharing the little research that is out there and for stressing the need that more research is required. We obviously can empathize with that as well. We did want to just share a couple more things before we did wrap up. We want to point folks to a couple initiatives that we work on here through the Research Institute. We have a podcast called Virtual Viewpoints, where we talk with practitioners, researchers, administrators, policymakers, anyone who is working in the area of digital learning research and how they're actually employing the research in practice. So if you'd like to check out the podcast, you can click that link there to listen to past episodes. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll share my email address, and we'd be happy to have you as a guest as well. We also have a guest blogger program, so if you'd like to click that link, you can learn more about that initiative if you're interested in writing for us. Faye, I see your question there about a copy of the recording. I will be sharing that in just a second. We have a YouTube channel where we host the recordings of all of our webinars. We do have an upcoming webinar next Tuesday on the 26th after the holiday weekend. We'll be hearing from Lisa Hasler-Waters, Michael Menchaca, and Jared Borup about parental involvement in K-12 online learning, which was the topic of another chapter in the handbook, which we briefly mentioned today. And if you'd like to find us online, you can reach out to us via email there, mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking the link there. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handles are listed, as well as our LinkedIn page. Our YouTube channel, which is MVLRI1, is where we host the recordings of the webinars. I should have the recording up likely by the end of the day Tuesday, so we'll be on the lookout for that. And we also have our webinars page where you can find all of the archives of our past webinars, as well as the scheduled upcoming webinars that we have. I did want to leave you with a poll right quickly before we left, so I'll open that up, and after you've answered that poll, actually 2 polls, you'll be free to go. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great holiday weekend. We really appreciate you coming out, and we really appreciate our presenters again for the presentation. Thank you.